For all the fighting talk from Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren and Aston Martin over the winter, Red Bull and Max Verstappen still ground them into dust in the first race of 2024. We expected Red Bull and Verstappen in particular to be very strong in Bahrain, and they were, but they were also made to look even better by just how bad their rivals were, and in this video we're going to explain why. Ferrari was expected to be Red Bull's closest challenger in Bahrain, and that proved to be the case. Pre-race, team principal Fred Vasseur even talked up the chances of more teams putting Red Bull under pressure in 2024, forcing them to compromise on strategy and setup because Red Bull wouldn't have the same comfort zone they enjoyed in 2023. But the Bahrain Grand Prix played out completely within Verstappen's comfort zone. So what went wrong for Ferrari? Well, the biggest problem was that the team's faster driver, Charles Leclerc, endured a nightmare race, blighted by persistent brake locking caused by one front brake running at a much higher temperature than the other. Leclerc visibly lost confidence in his car as it veered to the right in the heavy braking zones. He said this severely compromised his pace for the first 15 to 20 laps before it stabilised. This meant we never got to see the two fastest drivers of the weekend go head to head in the race. Leclerc set the fastest lap of the whole event in Q2, so if anyone was likely to take the fight to Verstappen here, it was Leclerc. The Ferrari SF24 was stronger than Red Bull in the more downforce dependent middle sector and slightly better in the final sector. Had Leclerc strung together his three best sectors, he'd have beaten Verstappen to pole by 0.68 seconds. But it's not unusual for Ferrari to be a threat in qualifying. Its big focus has been on improving race pace, and the Bahrain Grand Prix was meant to be the first test of whether that improvement really had come. Both drivers talked up the prospect, with the improved aerodynamic stability and reduced wind sensitivity, meaning the tyres should be less stressed. Vasseur had also promised Ferrari was on another planet in terms of tyre degradation after testing, and insisted Ferrari was closer to Red Bull here than it was in 2023. However, Carlos Sainz found the tyre degradation worse than he would have liked in FP2, so there were still question marks hanging over Ferrari heading into the race. And unfortunately, on account of Leclerc's problems and Sainz spending the first part of the race bottled up behind slower cars, we didn't get to see Ferrari's race pace claims properly stress tested. Leclerc said the brake issue made his race impossible, and that without it, he was convinced he would have beaten Perez to second and got much closer to Verstappen than anyone else managed. Sainz felt he lost too much time stuck behind Leclerc. Once into clean air, Sainz did at least keep Perez honest in the battle for second, but A, that's Perez, not Verstappen, and B, Sainz still averaged 0.3 per lap slower than Verstappen for the last 46 laps of this race. Nevertheless, Sainz's performance suggests Ferrari definitely was closer to Red Bull on race pace in Bahrain than it was 12 months ago. Vasseur said Ferrari had closed the gap by 50%, but we probably won't really know how much progress Ferrari has made until we get a straight fight at the front between Leclerc and Verstappen. Despite enjoying its best pre-season of Formula 1's current ground effect era and George Russell splitting the Ferraris in qualifying, Mercedes endured a difficult first race. Russell ran into engine cooling problems that Mercedes admitted after the race it didn't fully understand, while Lewis Hamilton battled battery problems for the first 10 laps and then overheating brakes and a loose seat. Russell and Hamilton were both told to lift and coast to control skyrocketing temperatures. Team boss Toto Wolff indicated this cost Mercedes 5 to 6 tenths of a second in lap time. A similar problem afflicted Mercedes customer Williams, but not McLaren or Aston Martin, which Wolff called unexpected. Without that, Russell would likely have been in the podium battle with the Ferraris and Perez, rather than clinging on for fifth against Lando Norris's McLaren. But it's not all doom and gloom for Mercedes, even after such a tough race. Third in qualifying, 0.3 off pole, was a pleasant surprise to the team after testing, where it hadn't been confident in the single lap potential of the W15. But even more crucial than the outright pace of this car is that Mercedes has conclusively proved its main problem from last year has been solved. That's the rear end instability that sapped the confidence of both drivers. Russell described this problem as cured. Even Hamilton, who had a messy qualifying and was only 9th fastest, made positive noises about the different feeling of the car underneath him now compared to last year. Although that significant 2023 problem is apparently fixed, primarily thanks to a combination of changes to the suspension and also the improved rear aerodynamics, Mercedes was giving away significant time in the more downforce dependent middle sector in Bahrain, where Russell was 3.5 tenths slower than Sector 2 pace setter Leclerc. That suggests that while the stability is improved, there could still be a downforce deficit for Mercedes to work on over the coming races. Judged against the back end of last season and the fighting talk of closing the gap to Red Bull further, it was disappointing to see McLaren qualify on the 4th row and kept at arm's length by Ferrari and even Russell's compromised Mercedes, especially as it became clear that the McLaren has not been improved as much as needed in its core underlying weaknesses. That said, McLaren's qualifying performance compared to last year's was transformative in a very good way. It was the biggest year-on-year improver at around 1.8 seconds, comparing its fastest Q2 time in 2023 to the lap Lando Norris did to qualify 7th this year. And had Norris produced a clean final run in Q3, he could have been on the first 2 rows of the grid. Norris was actually quicker than Verstappen across sectors 2 and 3 and only qualified 4/10 off pole, roughly where McLaren was in qualifying in the 2023 season finale in Abu Dhabi. So McLaren was still there or thereabouts over a single lap, even with a less than ideal end to qualifying at a track that exposes where it still needs to make gains with its car. That's all important context to consider. Norris even swung from a fairly pessimistic outlook to being genuinely buoyed by the fact McLaren was this close when it can still improve so much in areas it remains weak. But his teammate Oscar Piastri's claim after qualifying that Red Bull didn't look quite as ominous as McLaren feared was proven emphatically wrong. McLaren was no threat in the race to the lead Mercedes and Ferraris, let alone looking like a team in a position to challenge Red Bull. But Norris said this was not far off where McLaren expected to be at this track, while team principal Andrea Stella stressed the reference for McLaren right now is Ferrari, Mercedes and Perez, not Verstappen's Red Bull. Mid-corner rotation is still difficult with this car, which compromises corner entry and exit, at slow speed in particular. Stella admits that in this area, McLaren is still not where it wants to be. That is going to require further aerodynamic and mechanical upgrades to sort, and it means McLaren must battle its lingering weaknesses for longer. Although the silver lining is that upcoming tracks with faster corners like Jeddah, Melbourne and especially Suzuka should play more to the car's inherent strengths. Last year's second best team in the season opener was only 1 place worse off in qualifying this time around, but it had a much worse Grand Prix and was nowhere near close to being a podium contender. While realistically it was not expecting a repeat of 2023's podium finish before the weekend, Aston Martin obviously hoped for a much better result than the last 2 places in the top 10. Fernando Alonso was massively surprised to qualify 6th with what he called an exceptional lap, but he never looked like consolidating that position in the race, let alone building on it, and said afterwards that finishing 9th and 10th was exactly in line with the team's pre-race simulations. He slipped back through the opening stint and spent much of the race closer to the midfield pack than the cars fighting to be best of the rest. The only remotely positive thing is that the team is adamant the new car does offer a better development platform than the one it struggled to upgrade consistently in 2023, and in fact Alonso suggested this better platform has required deliberate sacrifices in terms of some of the car characteristics that made the Aston so potent at the start of last season. Alonso hinted at that making for a slow start to 2024 for Aston, especially after some inconclusive feelings from testing, but with the expectation of better performance in the development race that will eventually bring Aston properly into the fight. After qualifying, Alonso thought his team was starting more brightly than that, but it looks like Aston Martin might need these car improvements quite rapidly to avoid more races spent scrapping for minor points finishes.